but we'll work up a few events leading up to that. And to that end, we're also going to kind of looking at this moment, a kind of rebirth of sorts. As you've noticed, as we've gone through this, there have been pockets and groups and places where people were doing still certain things, whether it be Shabbat or some doing a little bit of kosher or the feast or a combination of all. It wasn't the majority by far, and even then, the ones who did a combination of all was very, very far few in between. And by the time we got to like the Inquisition and whatnot, we really didn't have much of that happening within Western Christianity. Um, for those who weren't here last week, the recording we did didn't, if I understand right, didn't come on correctly. But last week, one of the things we talked about too, as it involves that, was how in Goa, India, what happened there during the Inquisition, specifically of the Portuguese when they went over there, the Spanish Inquisition, that they instituted against those who were Sabbath keeping, kosher keeping, so on and so forth. And these were Gentiles. They weren't Jews, although there were some Jews there for sure, but it was Gentiles. And we talked about the fact that in one day in particular, there was over 100 of them that were burned at the stake, professing that they were Christians, not Jews, because that's what they were being burnt for. So there's a lot of, the last couple of weeks has been a little bit more, I guess you could say, moody and dark, so to speak. And we will have one big event we'll talk about today that is like that. But for the most part, I think we're going to finally get to a little more levity, especially by the end of the today, excuse me. So with that said, that's what we just did. We kind of reviewed a little bit of what we talked about. As always, as a point of reference, go back, listen, watch, whatever, to the things that we've talked about. For those who have PowerPoints or want them, let me know. I will give them to you. I'll be more than happy to. Because I know it's been a lot over the last, this is the seventh one, so over the last 7 weeks, but we've been doing it for about 10. And just certain verses I would say definitely to always keep in mind, or especially what Paul said in Acts 20, I think it was, Acts 20 or 21, when he's giving his something like a last encouragement and admonishing and kind of prophetic warning that he gave to the leaders that he had established in various congregations. We had looked at that on the first week. And that is definitely one to always keep in mind, because he warned about how people, even amongst the leadership that he had in front of him, were going to come in and try to twist things. And very much that's what we've been looking at, how through leadership, not all of them, but through the leadership, there were twists that came in, especially in those first couple centuries, all those quotes that we looked at. That was very heavy with quotes in those first couple lessons. And so, we looked at when Christ was sacrificed, sometime between 27 to 33 AD. This kind of gives you a little bit of a chart of some of the things we went over. The areas that we really keyed up on was more a little bit before 70 AD, and then we talked about the destruction of the temple, how that affected things within the faith as a whole, both for the Jews who weren't believers in Messiah and the ones who were believers in Messiah, including the Gentiles that were coming in. And leading through that next century, we talked about how the theology was developing that, hey, well, the Jews have lost their temple, right? They've gotten kicked out of Israel, especially by 135 to 140 AD, when Roman finally did the final Roman exile of all the Jews from Israel, or the bulk of them anyway. And for a lot of the Gentiles who were up and coming into leadership at that time, a lot of them took this as, well, maybe that's what all this is. Maybe this really is God's punishment. And in a sense it was, but they took it further. It was more than just a punishment, like we've seen throughout the Bible that happens to Israel. They took it as, well, God's actually, now he's done with them. This isn't the cyclical punishment that they go through. This is the final end-all, be-all, and they are no longer the people. We are. And that was where that strains of thought started to develop. We looked at a lot of that in our first and second time we were together. Eventually, we got to looking at the councils of Nicaea, Laodicea, and other councils that came together, where essentially, as it involves Western Christianity, the full cutting off of the roots really became official. It wasn't just some leaders here and there. At that point, that's where we got to that point where it was legislated from church councils. That's be the right wording. It was legislated out, where really the cutting of all these things was done away with. Again, as involves the majority of Western Christianity. But one of the things that we made note of as we looked through some of that was that we still had a lot of quotes from various church leaders like Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, if you guys remember him. where he was rebuking people in the church from still having good relations with the Jews, going to the synagogue, and that was going up into the 6th century. The fact that there were a lot of quotes like that we were able to look at and pull from tells us that regardless of leadership, regardless of legislative council things that they put out there to separate us from our roots, a lot of the mainstream people were still doing exactly that, trying to keep Shabbat, going out and meeting up with Jews, whether they be believing Jews or not, meeting sometimes at the synagogue for the feast because they understood that there's still something there. It literally had to be forced. It wasn't natural. It had to be forced onto the body to separate these things out. Wow. And that was a big thing to pay attention to as we went through this history, because in most seminaries and most other things, and well-to-do, very well-to-do pastors, well-meaning pastors today, the teaching is, well, these things just kind of went away naturally. It was, God was done with that stuff, and so over the next century, we just realized that that's what it was supposed to be. But what we have looked at is that it's anything but. Right. There was nothing. There wasn't some natural, like, oh, okay, this stuff is just God's done away with now. It was severe cutting in until eventually the 4th and 5th century in particular, it was like taking a sword to that mentality to chop it off. And quite literally, 1,000 years later in the Inquisition and things like that, literal sword being used to try to stop these things. Persecution to stop these things. So there wasn't anything natural. There wasn't some natural, hey, we just realized we don't do this anymore. It was nothing like that, nothing of the sort. So, picking up into where we are now, we're going to look at the next couple hundred years very briefly, and just some context setting for what was happening within Christianity. Again, specifically Western Christianity. But in the 17th century, so that's 1600s to 1700s, constant wars were happening in Europe. A lot of them religious, or a lot of them sometimes under a religious guise, because they were really more political than anything else. But a lot of religious wars were happening, especially with the Protestants, various groups of Protestants that were coming out, wars between them and the Catholic states, if you will. The colonization of the world by European powers was in full swing, and with that, the faith was being brought into many other areas of the world, usually through missionaries. The Catholic missionaries, and then you had the Protestant missionaries, which they tended to butt heads wherever they went, unfortunately. They did not get along very well together. There was a lot of rough, what's the word I'm looking for here? A lot of agitation between these two groups when it came to the missionary efforts around the world, as one could imagine. And so by the end of the century, we have the Enlightenment that starts to sweep over Europe. And, well, the Enlightenment is important because it was kind of bringing back this Renaissance man idea within a lot of the European people. So there was secularization that was beginning to develop. And this had an impact on the church too, because for better or worse, a lot of the seminaries were in some ways re-looking at certain things because of the Enlightenment, because of mentalities and how people did stuff. Some of that was good, but there were some areas where they went too far, and we'll talk about that in the next couple slides as well. Science was beginning to boom big time. And the way we think of it, the science of the modern age. You had notable scientists like Galileo, you had Johannes Kepler, Blaise Pascal, Robert Boyle, Isaac Newton, Gottfried Wilhelm, and many, many others. Funny enough, too, all these guys who considered big scientists of their time, they were all also very, very religious. Many of them wrote a lot of their own commentaries on the Bible. Isaac Newton wrote more about theology than he ever did about science, right? A lot of people nowadays don't necessarily realize that, but these guys believed in science because they believed in a God of order. Right. And so they knew that if there was a God of order, you could look at the world and try to study it and understand it, as opposed to it being all chaos and randomness. That was a big thing for a lot of them. However, again, with the Enlightenment period, that would start to change for some. This would lead, eventually, by the end of this, going into the 18th century, it would lead for the Enlightenment and stuff like that into secular humanist ideology, humanist thinking. Some of the founding fathers were just as, just as influenced by the theological stuff as they were of some of this type of things, the secular humanist theology. That's why some of the founding fathers were deists for that reason. All right, so going into the 18th century, that's 1700s to 1800s, again, with all the scientific breakthroughs and things that were happening, there was a lot of political theory that was changing. And with that came a lot of social revolution. We get the American Revolution, the French Revolution, the revolution in Haiti, the Haitian Revolution. They would all see breakaways from the monarchies. This would start a trend going from the 1800s and then further, where a lot of groups would eventually start breaking off from their old empires that they were a part of, especially as you got into the 19th century, World War I, World War II. A lot of that happened. But in any case, all this stuff was happening, and it was causing, within the church, certain things to change, because the church, for better or worse, during this time, be it the Catholic and some of the Protestants, were very heavily linked in with their political states that they were in. This saw, even within the church, some breakaway. A lot more people saying, hey, we can't just say, as long as the king does it, it's all fine and good, but the people, we got to tell them to do this, tell them to do that. They realize that there has to be a better accountability across the board. Social class shouldn't be always taken as the means by which you judge people, kind of like it says in James, right? You don't show favoritism. There was a lot of favoritism in much of the church at this time for those who were the ruling class, ruling elites, or those who were wealthy. And so there was a lot of that change, which was good. That was a good change that happened, be it the Catholic or Protestant. And it's during this time, too, that, that's next time. We'll get to that in a second. Before I get to that part, also, as it involves these revolutions, if you guys have heard of the French Revolution, after this, they would end up having a dictator, Napoleon. The Haitian Revolution would fall apart. The American Revolution was really the only one that seemed to solidify and kind of turn into anything, for better or worse. And, well, a lot of that was because the American Revolution was heavily based on utilizing Judeo-Christian framework for its whole worldview and way of looking at things, the treatment of people. It didn't do it perfectly, no. But because it held more to that, unlike the French Revolution, which was very secular and very, very bloody, the American Revolution wasn't that way. And so that was a good thing that happened. Obviously, as it involves us, we're all here in America, right? And so all our various backgrounds, most of us, unless you came from a different country, or second generation, most of us are heavily affected, obviously, by that, because all of our churches come through the American framework, if you will. That said, as we go into this time, because of the Enlightenment and how that was affecting some of the seminaries, especially in Germany. Germany was a major center for philosophy education at this time. Some of the most brilliant philosophers and people were coming out of the German Empire, the German area, Austria-Hungary, and so on and so forth. And they tended to approach the Bible with a much more allegorical approach. Because during the Enlightenment and whatnot, one of the things they did with the Bible was say, well, some of these obviously are exaggerated stories, right? They can't be exactly true. A literal 7-day creation, a literal flooding of the whole world, things like that. They started to critique these things. And there's something known as higher textual criticism or textual criticism and other kinds of things like that within the academics of Bible study. This is the time where that stuff started to develop. And a lot of it came from a more secular, almost atheistic view of the Bible, or would add on to that. But that was being done in the seminaries. Now, some would say, no, there really is a God, but some of this is just maybe a little too much, so there's allegory. There's more allegory than that. And obviously, there's always, within the Bible stories, a deeper spiritual meaning. However, when one takes that deeper spiritual meaning and takes that over the also literal meaning, and or in spite of the literal meaning, and says that the literal meaning didn't happen at all, it's just a story for our own knowledge, or just like the stories of Zeus and so on and so forth. There's moral learning to happen from these things, but it's not literal. That was starting to develop more and more. And so, again, the problem with that is that if you do that with the Bible, where do you stop? As it involves replacement theology, we had already talked how there were some people who brought in allegorical ways of thinking into the Bible centuries before. This just took it even further. And this definitely brought in a more almost secularization of some aspects of the faith that would develop little by little over the next couple centuries. So, also during the 1800s to 1900s, we get some big events that happen within the Protestant movement in particular. Modern dispensationalism, as it's called. This is the stuff that comes from the man Darby. You guys probably heard of him. The pre-tribulation rapture theory. He developed that. This idea that there will be a rapture before the tribulation, before things get really bad. And then you have 7 years of Jacob's trouble, is usually how they define it. And then you get the millennium where everybody comes back. Also, modern dispensationalism, even if it doesn't hold to a pre-trib rapture, was very much a view of looking at the Bible as God working through the world in what they call, I think, was it 5 or 7 dispensations. And the idea is that God worked differently in each dispensation with people. Different rules, laws, sometimes morality. They wouldn't use that wording fully. I'm using that wording, the different morality, because it ends up being what it is. For God to say, hey, during this first 1,000 or 500 years, I'm going to deal with them. These things are wrong, these things are right. The next 500,000 whatever years, I'm going to tweak that. Now these things are wrong, these things are right. The ultimate reasoning behind that framework was because they wanted to explain why the law wasn't fully in place anymore. So this became a framework on which to explain that, even though the Bible doesn't actually teach that the law is done away with. But remember, at this point, most mainstream Christian theology, the main foundation, or one of the main foundations, is the law is done away with. The church is the new Israel, or some version of that. So now, during this time, there are doctrines that are coming out to help explain this better, especially within a more Protestant worldview and not Catholic worldview. This was definitely one of those things that came out. During this, by the end of the 1800s, you'd have the Jehovah's Witnesses, Watchtower Society, you have the Mormons here in America that would kind of start to develop and branch out. And then toward the end of this century, we would have the first World Zionist Congress. What is that? What does that have to do with Christianity, some people will ask. Well, that was the first gathering together of a group of Jewish Zionists who were started to say, listen, and as we've looked at over all these centuries, they're done with all the persecution. They want to go home. And they started trying to see how can they practically start getting efforts in to start going over there. By the end of the 1800s, small waves of Jews would start moving to Palestine. By the way, even before this, there were some that did. And I call it Palestine because that was kind of the general name given to it at the time. So that was beginning to happen. And this is huge because it's also during this century and the century before where you started having more and more, specifically within the Protestant denominations. Catholics won't see this again for a little while, but within the Protestant denominations, you started to see more and more coming out saying, you know what, I think God still has a plan for the people of Israel. Some of them started to say, wait a minute, when we're looking at this, the Bibles, the prophecies, people like Jonathan Edwards, people like, what's that one guy? I thought I put his name in here, I did not. Oh, it escaped me, it'll come to me in a little bit. There was a few different others, and Puritans as well, some, not all, who started to say they have the expectation that the Jews were going to be coming back to Israel and that God was going to do something with them there. He would bring them back mostly in unbelief, but then eventually, while they're there, he would deal with them and bring them into belief. Now, some of these Protestant groups had various teachers who were teaching that. Even if they did believe that, hey, the church is kind of the new Israel, God still has something planned for his physical people. So you had some who were saying that here and there, some of them being big, big teachers. And the cool thing is whether they were realizing it or not, they were planting the seeds to prep the church for what was to come. And so that's a really cool thing. We're going to look at some of that on a different level a little later. I brought this guy up because I thought he was a really cool, interesting guy. He's the first Jewish prime minister. So England had exiled the Jews for about 100 years and eventually allowed them back in, getting into I think it was the early 1800s. That's where this man, Benjamin Disraeli, was eventually born and got into politics there in England, eventually becoming a prime minister there. He was a Jew by ethnicity, but he was a believer in Yeshua. He didn't call himself a Messianic Jew or anything like that, but he was someone who still held to his Jewish ways in that he did Passover in a Jewish manner and things like that. There's a lot of politics that was going on at the time, and so there were a lot of people who played on the fact that he was like that as a means of trying to put the people against him, because what great way to add suspicion to somebody than say he's a Jew and he does Jewish things. He's not a real believer, this, that, and the other. The queen eventually asked him something along the lines of, give it to me straight now. What are you really? Are you a Christian or are you a Jew? Because you can't be both. And he responded to her, ma'am, I am the blank page between the Old and the New Testaments. which I love that he responded that to her. So, in other words, he's like, I'm both. I'm the fulfillment of that. I'm the real Jews in that sense, so to speak. Is kind of what he was saying. Anyway, it's a cute little thing. That would have been towards the late 1800s. I'm sorry, I don't think I have the specific years. I do not, sorry. And I did not put it in my notes. I apologize. He would have been in the late 1800s. I believe it was around 1850s or 60s when he became the prime minister. It was towards the 1880s. I apologize. I should have had that fresh in my mind. This is a guy who, during the 1800s, he died in 1899. Joseph Rabin, and I cannot pronounce his name right. Rabinowitz. Some of y'all already know who he is. I'm glad about that. This, in many ways, this man is an almost first fruits of the rekindling, if you will, of the fullness of the Messianic movement. All right? This guy would definitely plant some seeds. He originally, he was born Jew. His father was actually a very famous rabbi there in Central Europe. His line went back to one of the big teachers of the Talmud, going back about a century or two before him. So you can imagine him probably growing up with that kind of weight on him. But in any case, his brother-in-law would end up giving him a copy of the New Testament and saying, I think this is the guy we've been looking for. Wow. Right? And at the time he was around 19, right? So he was still really young, but he looked at this and eventually came to faith, believing in Yeshua. However, unlike not all, but many Jews by this time who did come to the faith and then were pressured or went with the pressure to leave behind their Judaism, their Jewishness, right? He didn't. Wow. He refused to do that. And because he said, no, there's no issue. There is no issue. As he kept reading it, he's like, no, this all goes with everything that I was brought up with. There's no difference here. And so it was after a wave of persecution. In Russia was where he was, Western Russia, near Ukraine. He would end up making a congregation there called the Israelites of the New Covenant was the name. He did this after a lot of persecution was happening in Russia. We've talked so much about persecution, I'm not going to go over the details because we've talked about that a lot the last couple of times. But he would... Because of this persecution, there were a lot of Jews who either left to America from Russia or went to Palestine. Again, at the time it was called Palestine. Some people did still call it the Holy Land or the Land of Israel, but that was a name that you'll see given to it a lot during this time. It was under Ottoman rule, so the Muslims were still in control of it all, and it was a province under them. But he went to Israel, and when he got there to the Holy Land, he traveled around, and he saw that many were going there to try to rebuild a little bit, as a means of getting away from persecution. But he also noticed a lack of faith in so many, mainly because there were Jews that were becoming more and more secular during this time, especially due to the Enlightenment, due to all the persecution and everything. You had a lot of Jews who went there if they were believers in Yeshua. Again, most Jews who, by this time, who were believers in Yeshua, you didn't keep your Judaism, you didn't keep your Jewishness. The church didn't allow it. So they kind of just were soaked in, all right? But when he got there, he noticed this, and it kind of disturbed him. And he kept thinking to himself, well, even then, with us coming back, it would be under Ottoman rule. It's not really our place yet. And he found himself very disturbed. And so on his last day there, he went to the Mount of Olives. And in his writings, he said that he felt Yeshua appear to him. And he realized that, in his words, the way to fix us all was through his brother. That was his words, his brother Yeshua. Right? Because he understood that this is his kinsman. And he realized that it's through him that eventually everything will get fixed as it involves Israel, the land. And so that made a spark in him when he came back to Europe and to Russia, where he did eventually make this congregation a literal, true, first at least fully documented, messianic congregation, if you will, of Jews. He would spread the word among his kin, his people. And many of them, because they already respected him, and because he didn't let go of his roots, because he didn't change, many of his brothers and sisters came to faith. Wow. They started a fairly good congregation there. Amen. There were those, even within the Christian faith, the Protestants and whatnot, who started to say, wow, something different about him, because they also heard the way he spoke. And so there's this one Christian minister, his name is Mr. Fabier. I'm not pronouncing that right. He had personally observed in Rabinowitz in Galatia and Lithuania, and this is the description that he ends up giving of him. It says that he is a preacher of the gospel in the spirit of Jewish nationality. A preacher so gifted, so versed in Scripture, so deeply rooted in the divine word of the new covenant as the Jewish nation has not possessed since the day of the apostles. This is of great importance. His sermons, published in Hebrew, Russian, and the jargon called Yiddish, which reached 10,000 copies in the masses of the Jews from Eastern Europe. They found eager readers in the most remote districts of Serbia and in the secluded valleys of the Carpathian Mountains. This guy would have an impact. I had only just learned about this guy a few years back, and I did some readings on him because I found it fascinating. And it also led me to discover that there was a bigger wave of faith amongst Jews like him that started to develop. And we're going to get a little bit more to that as well, but it's not something you hear almost barely anything about. It's very hard to find. So some suggested readings as it involves this guy, because I would definitely suggest to read up on him. It's very interesting. His autobiography, which you can find, he wrote it. You can find copies of it online for free. But then also something to buy is this. It's Joseph Rabinowitz in the Messianic Movement, the Herzl of Jewish Christianity. Herzl, the reason it says that is because Herzl was many consider the father of modern Zionism. He was the one that started that first Zionist Congress in the late 1800s and started to get that ball moving in a practical sense of bringing the people back to the Holy Land. So, but yeah, those two books. Well, the first one a book, the other one's only a few pages. You can find it online. I think you'll find them very interesting and edifying.
Didn't he also revive Hebrew as a language?
Herzl did, not this guy.
Yeah.
But again, we'll keep the comments and questions for after. So the only downer we're going to talk about today, and very briefly, I only have a few slides for it, is the Holocaust. Why am I bringing up the Holocaust? Because again, as it involves the faith, it's not that the church is the new Israel. Israel, generally speaking, is the church. And as it involves the faith, as it involves the Jewish people being brothers in that faith, even if they're not all believers in Yeshua, there's still something of a kinship that should be there. The Holocaust should affect all of us. And so with the Holocaust, I'm not going to go through all the details. You guys know, especially here, you know what it is, what happened. But obviously, 400 years, almost exactly to the year after Martin Luther proposed to the leaders of his time the solution to the Jewish problem with his letter that we had talked about last week. We went over the 7 things that he brought up, what to do with the Jewish people, and quite literally every single one of them, and we mentioned that last week, were things that happened during the Holocaust. Quite literally, practically put into place. Before the Holocaust, there were about 9.5 million on average Jews in all of Europe. Almost 2/3 of them would be killed during the Holocaust. All right? 1.7% of the total European population and about 60% of the global Jewish population lived in Europe. In other words, of all the world, only 1.7% of the population in Europe was Jewish. And again, that Jewish population was about 60% of all the Jews in the world. You would have had mainly Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews there, not Mizrahi. But 6 million Jews were exterminated during the Holocaust. About 2 million of them were children. All right? Yeah, almost 2/3 of all European Jews were wiped out in about 10 years because of the systematic killing that was perfected by the Nazi war machine. So, unfortunately, this was very much the culmination, of much of the anti-Semitism that we were looking at through the last couple of weeks. You saw the vitriol that was in some of those statements. Some of the statements were, in the beginning, more anti-Jewish, more culturally whatnot. But as time went on, it became very anti-Semitic, and it was hating on the Jews themselves. We saw that as early as the 7th century with Chrysostom, John Chrysostom, when he said, "I hate the Jews, God hates the Jews, and you should hate the Jews." Quotes like that. These are the things that became the very bedrock of cultural Europe. Why? Because Europe was culturally Christian, for better or worse. And because those things were very much in the subtext of the mind of the Christian, it made it very easy for Hitler to come and say, I'm just doing what Martin Luther said to do. But don't get me wrong, Hitler was not a believer in any shape or form. But he knew how to use religion and things like that as a means of power. And unfortunately, the faith in Europe had become very easily usable because of the rhetoric within Christianity by some well-meaning pastors and priests and others who were just seeds of Satan himself. But in any case, I want to read to you this parable that a man named Joel Richardson wrote in a book called When a Jew Rules the World. A little tongue-in-cheek there. It's about replacement theology and stuff. It's a book I suggest you read. But this parable he wrote, it's called The Tale of Two Sons. I'll try to keep a straightness as I read this. Once upon a time, there was a father who had one son. The father had raised his only son from a very young age in the ways of the Lord. He would pray over his child as a baby and sing him to sleep with spiritual songs from the scriptures. As the boy grew, the father read his son Bible stories and taught him the scriptures. He instructed him to distinguish right from wrong. The son became a very proficient student in the Word of God, even at a young age. As the boy reached the age of 16, the father heard about another young man who was in desperate need of a home and a family. Although he knew that this boy had a very difficult life and continued to have many problems, after prayerfully weighing his decision, he felt it was right to adopt this young man into his family. But it was not until the boy had lived for some time with the family that the father learned the full extent of his new son's past. He discovered that by the age 11, his adopted son had already immersed himself into drug culture. And by 13, he was getting high every day. And of course, there was theft, vandalism, violence, and so much more. Before he even came into the home by age 18, the boy had been arrested several times. But then the unexpected happened. After hearing the word of God for the first time, the adopted son repented of his sins of his former life, and believing in Yeshua, he fully dedicated his life to the Lord. The transformation was wondrous to behold, and it surely made the father's heart rejoice beyond expression. But this was not the only unexpected thing that happened. At the same time, the adopted son came to faith. The natural son, who had been raised in the ways of the Lord, suddenly left home. He began drinking and doing drugs, and soon it was as if he had fully taken on the former life of his adoptive brother. It was not long before he had even surpassed his brother's depravity. He became reckless in his sins and actually began to prostitute himself. When the father learned all of this, he was heartbroken beyond expression. And when the newly converted adoptive son learned of the wickedness of his brother, he sought him out, berated him for his sins, and lectured him concerning his behavior. But when he refused to repent, in a fit of self-righteous rage, the adoptive brother beat the naturally born son to death. The father was grieved in his heart. First, there was the unspeakable pain of watching his son, in whom he had poured his very heart and soul, as he turned to the ways of the world and gave himself over to complete reprobation, ultimately dying in a profoundly deprived state. Likewise, he was devastated for his adoptive son. For though he had greatly rejoiced when his son repented from his sins, his heart was doubly grieved that after receiving such forgiveness, such mercy and grace, that boy had become so self-righteous and arrogant that he had actually murdered his own brother. The father had the adoptive son arrested, and he was sentenced to life in prison. He remained there for the rest of his life, consumed with the most bitter regret. This is Joel Richardson's Parable of Christianity, Tale of Two Sons. This is his way of trying to describe what has happened in the faith as it involves with the Gentiles as a whole, generally speaking. Not every individual, but generally speaking, corporately speaking, did as they became the majority in the faith, and then thought themselves better and wise enough that they should go ahead and kick out those who were naturally born, and or tell them you can't do things that way and still stay in the faith. But what man intends for evil, right? God can do wonders with. So after the Holocaust, on a practical level, after the Holocaust, the Jews by this point had already spent 50 plus some odd years in waves traveling to the Holy Land, trying to get things ready. Small groups, 1,000 here, 10,000 there sometimes. But they found themselves getting to, especially leading up to the Holocaust, getting in a much harder position, those in Europe, to be able to leave and be allowed to go to. By this time, England was in charge of the Holy Land. They had taken it from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. But after the Holocaust, nobody had the gall to sit here and say, no, we can't allow them in the land. After the Holocaust, it was very much of, guys, who can speak against this? If only out of all the empathy of everything that just happened, most places were like, listen, let them go to the land, let them have it. And so 1948, prophecy, modern prophecy, was jump-started. Generally speaking, from the destruction of the temple, and one could probably even go as far as the ultimate exile, the Roman exile in 135 of Israel, there hadn't been much in the way of prophetic movement throughout the world, generally speaking. But at 1948 and since then, that has jump-started big time. Almost as if the final ticking clock of the end has been turned and the sands of time are beginning to drip through it. Because since then, so much has started to happen. 1948, they came back into the land. I know a lot of people like to reference the nation born in a day, and I like to sometimes reference that too, to when their day of independence. But even that's not fully fulfilled yet. There's still something more to that. In any case, 1967, many wars that they've been fighting since 1967, they finally took back over all of Jerusalem, which up to that point, even with them in the land, hadn't been actually under Jewish rule. But after 1967, they took it all. Eventually, it got split in half, and that's where we are right now. But that was huge because this is the first time that the land of Jerusalem, the area where the temple was under Jewish rule in almost 2,000 years. And this is the amazing thing. Within the next year, it was the first time they were able to celebrate the feast in Jerusalem by the temple grounds. And when they had a massive gathering of Jews, religious and secular, who were there were hundreds, if not thousands, who afterwards said that they saw Yeshua and he presented himself to them. There was a big wave of Jews who came to faith, not because people were preaching to them, but because they had a vision of Yeshua himself, kind of like Paul on the road to Damascus. Since then, this has continued to happen, not just to them, but also to many Arabs. I like to look at this as God saying, I'm done waiting for everybody else to do what I told them to do. Now I'm getting involved. Maybe, maybe not. I don't know. I look at it that way. In any case, while this was happening, also in the United States, you had the big Jesus movement and things like that were going on in the 60s and 70s. And there were actually a lot of Jews in that time that came here in the United States, came to faith. And a lot of these guys would go on to be the founders of many of today's Messianic congregations or organizations. So when I say that prophecy kind of kicking back into gear, that's what's kind of happening. And that's the times that we're in now. So, like I said, the nation born in the day, if you look at that, color is it on your screen? Mine is a little different. That greenish color that you see on that screen, I know, sorry, the map, it's squished in, but that green color you see, that was the land that was given to the state of Israel as a part of the initial partition before the war for independence. All right, in 1948, as soon as they declared independence, within 24 hours, 5 to 7 Arab nations invaded. They didn't wait. All right, they declared war and came in. They would win that war, and they would eventually expand almost 2 to 3-fold the land. Over all these years, that has only grown, and the only time it shrunk was really when they gave land away as a means for peace. A lot of people don't know that when referencing Israel. They think, oh, they're the occupiers, they've done this and that. Israel has given away huge chunks of land for the sake of just having peace, to which they haven't gotten, obviously. In any case, this is Israel in an Arab world. Now, this map actually still doesn't do it justice. This shows northern Africa, all right, of these countries that are Arab majority, or not Arab, that's actually bad wording. I should have gotten a different map. Muslim majority, not necessarily Arab. They're not ethnically Arab, but Muslims, the religion. You got Morocco, Tunisia, Libya, so on and so forth, all these other ones. Obviously, Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Iraq. But it goes further. You got Iran, you got Afghanistan, you got Turkey, and more going up that way, Pakistan. These are all Muslim nations who, on some level or another, have actually themselves vowed the destruction of Israel. That little piece of red that you can probably barely see on that map. All these nations are so troubled by this. And a lot of that has to do with also Muslim eschatology. We're not getting into that today. But yeah, that's a different Torah talk. One of the examples I wanted to give you of Israel and all the land it would gather in all these wars. You guys know how Israel looks today on our map? Well, at one point they had the whole Sinai Peninsula. They gave all of this back to Egypt for peace. They actually wanted to give them the Gaza Strip because that was part of Egypt at the time too. Egypt said, yeah, we'll take everything. For whatever reason, the Gaza Strip, Egypt said no. They didn't want it. So, not for nothing, Israel tried to give that away for peace, just so people know, a while back. All right, so all this that we've gone over the last several weeks of looking at those aspects of replacement theology, various quotes of various, be it Protestant or Catholic, et cetera, and how they viewed Israel as a nation or as a people. How does all that then work when the thing that majority, we talked the fact that there were some, but the majority of the churches all of a sudden have to now realize, wait a minute, all those people we said would never come back into the land, they're starting to come back into the land. How do we explain this? How does our theology work with this one? For most of us, our theology said the exact opposite would happen. They would never come back into the land. Can we say that these are God's people and he's blessing them now? Because look what's happening when so much of the church said, no, they're not blessed. They are the cursed ones, and so on and so forth. Just like in that parable we read. All right? The adoptive son arrogantly looking at the natural son saying God's done with them, so on and so forth. How does the church react to this? A few different ways. So, for some, it was but the confirmation of their expectations. Like I said, there were some, especially in the last 100 years before that were much more open about saying, no, there's going to be a future gathering, literal gathering of Israel. It's not allegorical. It's not something that's about the church. No, it's about the actual physical people. So some of those groups said, hey, this is what we've been talking about. For others, it was a wake-up call that maybe they needed to recheck their theology. And for some, this was just another event in history. They were more apathetic to it. Why? Because of their theology. They were like, yeah, okay, this happened, but it just is what it is. Maybe there's political reasons behind it. Everybody feels bad for them because of the Holocaust. Some went into conspiracy theories and whatnot. But yeah. And then for some replacement theologians, it was definitely a danger to their worldview that needed to be dismissed, excused, trivialized for the sake of their systematic theology, for the sake of what they believed. They had to find a way to explain this away. Right? N.T. Wright, he's a rather big modern academic, very much a replacement theologian of a type. If I remember right, he's from the Anglican tradition. He said, to suggest, therefore, that as Christians we should support the state of Israel because it is the fulfillment of prophecy is, in a quite radical way, to cut off the very branch on which we are sitting. In other words, he recognized that to accept that this is a work of God would be to deny what most of us believe. Because we can't believe that God's doing this. He's done with them. He's very much comes from that kind of view. And I give you this because it's an example of many like him. Now, a lot of this affects and or gets affected is the end-time worldviews that a person, a theologian or a school of teaching might have or hold to. All right? The end-time framework that one has will determine how one views what is happening around us as it involves the modern state of Israel. Last week we talked a little bit about the various main forms of eschatology, the end-time beliefs. You had the premillennial view, you had the amillennial view, postmillennial, and preterism. For the preterist, this coming together of the nation of Israel was almost anathema. All right? For the preterists, like this, all prophecy is done. This can't be prophecy. This can't be anything. So for them, they were kind of shaken by what was happening, and they tend to be the most maybe outspoken against Israel as a whole, the nation, the modern nation. Amillennial, this was definitely a thing for them where it was like, whoa, maybe we got to change some stuff in our theology, but maybe not. We don't really like this. And that big. Postmillennial, they're here and there. And premillennial, most premillennial groups were expecting something like this to happen on some level. In any case, Martin North said that Jerusalem had ceased to be a symbol of the homeland and Israel had ceased to exist, and the history of Israel came to an end, in reference to 70 and then 130 AD. In other words, he's like, this, whatever's happening now, this isn't anything to do with the Bible. This isn't God's work. And so that's how some have definitely reacted within the faith as it involves the modern state of Israel. There's more. A clear example of Christ's rule over the nations for his church was the destruction of the Jewish state that persecuted the early church. In destroying Israel, Christ transferred the blessings of the kingdom from Israel to a new people. The church, this is an important theme in the Gospels. This is Gary DeMar, big-time replacement theologian. And there's seminary schools that follow his stuff. So again, a lot of people that go to seminary schools, they're getting, even if they don't get told these specific quotes and whatnot, that theology is what they're learning. And every seminary school depends on the background. But this is another quote I'm about to show you. This next quote was not barely 5 years after the Holocaust. So think about that as we read it. God willed that after the institution of the new covenant, there should no longer be any Jewish people in the world. Yet here they are. That is a fact, a very sad fact. brought about by their wicked rebellion against God. But it is not monstrous to hold that by reason of this wickedness, the said undesired and undesirable group are now heirs to the many and exceedingly precious promises of God? Shall we be accused of anti-Semitism because we speak thus of the Jews? How is it possible to believe that there are still prophecies of divine grace to be fulfilled in a group upon which the wrath of God has come to the uttermost? That was by Albertus Peters in his book, The Seed of Abraham, written in 1950. Very much a reaction to what was happening. Like I said, how did the church react? That's a good question. I don't remember if he was Dutch or not. I don't believe he was Dutch now. So, yeah, he said that. That was, like I said, 1950. And there are others. I'm not going to go through all the quotes. There are plenty of books there. If you were to pick up any various modern systematic theology and look up what it says about Israel, you're going to see some other things, some filled with obvious, almost seemingly hate underneath, others filled with just more of a academic, theological, well, no, it's just the church is now the new Israel and so on and so forth, without any sense of malice behind it. But regardless, it all comes from the same bad interpretive method and bad demonic seed, which is that God is done with his people. He's not. That would make God a liar. And if God's a liar, going back to what N.T. Wright said, then what are we actually sitting on? A promises of God who lies? That can't be. All right. These are specific denominations who have quite literally made stances against the modern state of Israel, either through things they've written, legislation, so on and so forth. We got the United Methodist Church of Great Britain, the Presbyterian Church of the USA, the United Church of Christ, and the Church of Scotland. I'll get to that in a second. These groups have all either officially put out official documentation that kind of puts themselves against the state of Israel. Some of these actually send a lot of money to Palestinian groups, even if their intent is just the idea of, helping Palestinian refugees. Unfortunately, a lot of that money doesn't necessarily find its way to any of those people. All right, so that's just the reality. A lot of that ends up getting squiggled around to help make the very things that are used against the modern state of Israel and or the Jews in general. Despite some of these groups maybe best intentions, I don't think they do that intentionally, but that's just what happens. As you guys know, the Methodist Church here in the United States and the Presbyterian Church over the last decade had a huge split over the LGBTQ issues. So, go figure, right? You open yourself to some aspects of Satan, don't be surprised when he starts to take over more. Speaking of that aspect, since we've talked about how the church has deviated from its ways little by little, in our century, our century and the one right before it, since we're in the 2000s, right? Man, that makes me feel a certain way about my age. I can say that. Oh, that's so weird. So, looking at that, the church, especially in the more Western world, has started to devolve heavily into more liberal ways of looking at the Bible, which has only led to the next group going further, the next group going further, the next group going further. This is what happens when you start to do away with the Torah of God. Sometimes it takes a while, but eventually you get to a part where it's like the slippery slope of no way to go back. It just goes. And that is very much where we found ourselves becoming into. Many progressive groups use the same logic that groups from Reformed theology or whatnot in reference to the Torah and why it's done away with. They'll take that same logic and then just go a little further with it. But they stay logical to that system. They say, well, if this was done away with, how come not this part? I mean, because I know you like eating your pork and whatnot. I like doing this other stuff. So why not? I mean, if that's been all done away with, that's all the Levitical stuff. That's all the Levitical stuff. I had an acquaintance once. He actually went to Southeastern University. It's a Christian university. I think under the Assemblies of God, if I remember correctly. Don't quote me on that part, but it's a Christian university. And he was getting into debate, and this is years back, on Facebook, because he really went off the deep end into liberal stuff. Not so much that that's where the school was, but that's just where he went. And he was having a debate with somebody in reference to the Bible and talking about the wording of how certain things are in there. And he was arguing that God isn't really against homosexuality, that Jesus never said anything about it. And in fairness, Jesus didn't say anything about homosexuality. So he was technically right. But the reason he was saying that was because there was a certain assumption in there. The assumption that Yeshua wasn't still holding on to the Torah of his father. See, if you take away that aspect, then yeah, someone can say Jesus never talked about that, so why are we making a big deal? If you're the kind of person who says, like a conservative, Frank Turek, a cross-examined, a Christian apologist, he goes out there and a lot of times he says, if it's not repeated in the New Testament, it's not a commandment for us believers today. He says that a lot. Now, this is a conservative guy. He's not like an LGBT guy or anything like that. There's a lot of great stuff he puts out there. The problem with what he's saying, though, is, well, where's bestiality mentioned in any of the apostles? They don't talk about bestiality. All right? There are other things like that they don't talk about. It's just assumed. Or someone could say, well, when they mention sexual sin, that's what they're talking about. Fair enough. Define sexual sin using nothing from before Matthew. You can't do it. You have to go back to the Torah in order to define what sexual sin is. You can't do it without that. There's a reason, because that's what we're always supposed to go back to. Right. And so you got, I say all that to say, and then there's more to that, but progressive Christianity has only done what conservative fundamentalist Christianity did before. They just took it further than anybody else would. And so going back to my friend real quick as a quick antidote, wow, I can't speak. In reference to that, he made reference to that, and like I said, there was an assumption there that he made, and I went ahead and said to him, I says, yeah, you mentioned this. You say Yeshua never mentioned that, but what was he always making reference to? And I took him back to Leviticus. Didn't respond. It is what it is, but my point was, you got to go back to that. You have to go back to that. So, with all these things, again, that continual reaction to the state of Israel and whatnot, Pope Pius, my numbers evade me, the 7th? Yeah. In his 12th? Sorry, the 12th. Sorry. My bad. Catholics out there. My bad. He said this. Now, this guy was the one who was alive during the Holocaust and whatnot. Very much part of the Catholic tradition of that replacement theology thing, which this is what he said. So we looked at some of the Protestants. Here's the Catholic. By the death of our Redeemer, the New Testament took the place of the Old Law, which had been abolished. Then the law of Christ, together with its mysteries, enactments, institutions, and sacred rites, were ratified for the whole world in the blood of Jesus Christ. On the gibbet of his death, Jesus made void the law with its decrees and fastened the handwriting of the Old Testament to the cross, establishing the New Testament in his blood shed for the whole human race. So that's his take on that aspect, all right, of that aspect of replacement theology, because replacement theology isn't just specific to the people. It's also replacing God's laws, replacing God's ways with something else. The Vatican II Council was a better response of the Catholic Church to what happened with the Holocaust and whatnot. The Vatican II, in this council, under Pope John Paul II, they essentially, there's a few different things he was doing there. There were some changes the Catholic Church was making as it evolved its relationship with Protestants in general and other stuff. But one of the things that Pope John Paul did in this was very much denounce the Catholics' history of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish rhetoric. And Pope John Paul, by doing this, critiqued heavily, whether it be the popes, the councils, or the things that came before, in reference to the Catholic Church's treatment of Jewish people within Europe and elsewhere. He said this at one point: "We realize today how blind we have been throughout the centuries and how we did not appreciate the beauty of the chosen people, nor the features of our favored brothers. We are aware of the divine mark of Cain placed upon our forehead. In the course of centuries, our brother Abel has been lying, bleeding, and in tears on the ground through our fault, only because we had forgotten thy love. Forgive us of our unjustified condemnation of the Jews. Forgive us forgive us that by crucifying them, we have crucified you for a second time. Forgive us, we did not know what we were doing." Those are words of a man who realizes the corporate history, in this case of his institution, but of the people in the faith as a whole. And I love how he said, even if he himself hadn't, he said, "Forgive us, Father." All right, well, whether you think about Catholics, this and the other, put that all to the side. In this man did something right. All right, trying to fix certain things. In any case, as it involves modern theology, we have something, various bits and pieces. Sometimes it's called fulfillment theology. There's a version called covenant theology. All in all, these are all part of what's called supersessionism, which is replacement theology. Right? These are all the academic terms. I bring that for some of y'all's knowledge because sometimes you'll be talking to someone and they'll be like, no, I don't believe that there's a replacement. I just believe in the fulfillment theology. And that's that all these things were fulfilled and whatnot. And then when you push them on it, fulfilled in what means? Well, fulfilled ultimately through the church. So who's the church? Well, the church is Israel. No matter what, they still kind of end up going that route, even though they try to sometimes define things a little differently. There is also, to kind of break this down a little more, there's something called punitive supersessionism, economic supersessionism, and structural supersessionism. Again, supersessionism is just the academic term for replacement theology. So each one of these is, somebody might hold to all three, two, or even just one of these in the way they understand stuff, okay? And so if and when talking with someone about it, you'll have to really ask them questions, have a dialogue, be open with one another to understand where they're coming from. But punitive supersessionism is very much represented by such thinkers as Hippolytus of Rome, Origen, who we had talked about in the very beginning. Martin Luther was kind of this line. I'd say he's more than just this. But it is a view that the Jews who reject Jesus as the Jewish Messiah are consequently condemned by God, forfeiting the promises otherwise due to them under the covenants, and that as a whole, corporately, all of that is done. Because it is the punishment of the fact that corporately they've rejected, that corporately it's all done. Even if there's individuals who are coming in. It's punitive, right? The economic supersessionism is used as a technical theological sense of function, all right? It is a view that the practical purpose of the nation of Israel in God's plan has been replaced by the role of the church, right? The economy, that old covenant economy, has been transformed into a new covenant economy, and the church is the basis of that, right? This is, when we looked at Justin Martyr earlier on, he was definitely someone who had that kind of feel. There are others as well. Then there's something called the structural supersessionism, all right? That is, and I'm going to try to read this as best I can word for word. It refers to the narrative logic of the standard model whereby it renders the Hebrew scriptures largely indecisive for shaping Christian convictions about how God's work as a consummator and redeemer and engages humankind in universal and enduring ways. All right? In other words, the very structure on how God does things, again, has changed. Ultimately, as you can tell, all of these in some way, shape, or form affect how one views the nation of Israel or the people of Israel as a whole. Some groups hold to all three of these, some to just a part of it, but it still is based on some level of replacement theology. But with all that said, and with these reactions that the modern church has kind of had to what has been happening in the Middle East and God's movement in the Middle East, we find ourselves going back to a first century context. What do I mean by that? Well, for the first time since the first 100 years of the Christian history, the people are back in the land. All right? Even if not in their fullness, they've gone back there. There's a state for them there. All right? Further, they actually have their own full autonomy, which they didn't have in the first century. And they haven't had since the whole history of everything we've gone over. This event has been used by the Spirit to bring a renewed study into the context and meaning of the Scriptures from a Hebraic view. It just so happens that since that time I was talking about in the 60s, with more, especially Jews coming into the faith, a re-energized looking into, well, wait a minute, how do we understand and look at Paul? There's something called the New Perspective on Paul, which itself has gone through some evolution over the last few decades. But it's within academic circles, a lot of them re-evaluating things and saying, wait a minute, I'm being tongue-in-cheek when I say this, but this is kind of how it really is. What if we looked at Paul as a Jew and then read his writings from that point of view? Oh. What a difference that can make, right? You know, who would have thought it? But yeah, and so on a scholarly level, that has started to develop. And with that, we now have groups and peoples out there who are putting writings, even if they might not fully want to go that way by their own admission, saying, we might have messed this up a little bit in reference to Israel, in reference to the Torah, and so on and so forth. Even if they only go so far as to say, at a minimum, at least for the Jews, the Torah is still a thing. They might say it's still different for Gentiles, but even that is a big switch from the history of the church for the past almost 1,500 plus years at this point. Because as we looked at before, for a Jew who came into the faith and went into the church institutions, you had to give all that stuff up. Now at least there's that. And I'd say that's a step in the right direction, moving in the right direction for the bulk of the modern church. All right. In the last 80 years, the church in the West has, like I said, further degraded, though, as well when it comes to that splitting, right? The slow trickle of lawlessness that started with the feast, the food laws, the growing hate of the Jews has opened up the floodgates to full sexual depravity. The progressive movement within the faith builds upon this foundation of the law being done away with, but takes it to degrees that the creators of the concept would never dare to dream of. All right? And so in our day-to-day, I'll read just a little bit of this to you real quick. So in our day-to-day, what we want to find ourselves doing is what does this all ultimately have to do with us? What do we do? How do we react? One, as we involves our brothers in the faith who do hold to replacement theology on some level, whether they realize it or not, because most people, especially today, especially here in America, we're like, yeah, no, we're for the Jews, we're for Israel, this, that, and the other. That's great, but let's talk theology. What do you understand about Torah? What do you understand about so on and so forth? Paul's writings. Regardless of a person's opinion of the modern state of Israel, they tend to still, on average, be like, yeah, no, most of that is done away with, or some version of that. They might not say all of it. They might say some parts. They might say, no, we hold to the Ten Commandments, just everything else. Well, then, what about that fourth commandment, right? Things like that. That's where those discussions start. But knowing this history, one can try to pull and show them, like I said before, there wasn't a natural doing away with these things, that it was just, the Jews didn't understand it, and as time went on, they started to realize, this stuff is done away with. No, it wasn't. It was a couple centuries later taking a hammer to the very idea and splitting it off because there was nothing natural about it. And again, all the quotes and everything we've gone over, these are things that one can utilize when talking to people like that. And always remember, humility. I get very irritated when I see some people who, it's like, I'm in Torah now, and it becomes something of what does Hirschberg say? A Torah terrorist. Rabbi Hirschberg says that a lot. People become a Torah terrorist, and they want to just smack people on the other side of their head with the Torah, so to speak. Don't do the very thing that we've been going over about what was done, and don't do that. Don't do that from the opposite point of view, okay? Know that people, for better or worse now, our context is that people for over 100 years plus, 1,000 years, this was the understanding for a lot. This is the teaching that's been passed down to them. We read in Jeremiah the other day that the Gentiles will come and saying, our fathers inherited lies, right? That's very much a thing that has happened. And so in the same compassion that hopefully you were brought into this, have that. Know that when you're talking to somebody, be it of a different faith or somebody in the Christian faith, and you're telling them, know that when you tell them, hey, even if you don't use these words, this is what they're hearing. My mom is wrong, my dad is wrong. My grandmother, who spent countless hours praying on her knees for me, my brothers, my sisters, yada, yada, we're wrong about this. That's a hard thing for a person to accept. You get what I'm saying? And for some people thinking like that, they're like, man, because you've heard some people say, so what, are they all in hell, or are they all blah, blah, blah? I've had people react like that. And it's like, no, I'm not saying that. Also remember, there are plenty of people who have never probably even heard of Shabbat, never celebrated it, never kept the food laws, that are going to be with us in the kingdom to come. Because ultimately, we have to remember, it is Yeshua's blood that justifies us. The walk that God calls out for us is the walk, exactly that, the walk he calls out for us to do, due to the fact that we've been redeemed. Not as a means of redemption. And we want to always keep that in mind. That said, this is the history. This is everything that's led up to this moment. Again, guys, if you want PowerPoints, let me know. I'll send them to you. I'm going to put this up there if you want to take a picture of it. I got another slide, resources for further study. I didn't get everything from that book. However, most of what I've covered you'll find in this book, and also some other detail. When a Jew Rules the World by Joel Richardson. That's a great resource if you want to utilize it.
You can download it for free on the website.
Yeah. I did not know that. So, hey, there you go. There's a place you can get it for free. If not, you can buy it. It's up to you, okay? What was the name of it again?
The website is Joel's Trumpet.
All right, so Joel's Trumpet, the website Joel's Trumpet. If you want that first book, there's a PDF of all his books, but that book in particular you can find there and you can get it for free. Right? If you're watching streaming and you see this.
It's good to support his ministry.
That too, yeah. I mean, I would say buy it. There's also the FAI ministry that he's involved with and whatnot. One of the things I quoted on from the beginning, and also if you just want more context for what happened in that first century with the Jewish wars, there is volumes of the Jewish wars by Josephus, who was the first century Jewish historian who wrote down about the ongoings that he himself witnessed, saw, and or wrote about. All right. A lot of the quotes I used in the beginning, a lot from various church fathers and so on and so forth, you can find them at earlychurchtext.com or earlychristianwritings.com. And there you can find tons of English translations of a bunch of all those quotes and so many more, and tons of other stuff I didn't even bother with. All right. Another place you can find a lot of that is newadvent.org. It's a Catholic website. I utilize that as well for a lot of those quotes. All right. And then finally, if you want more academic sources, one of the main ones I used, but not limited to this, was Fordham University. There's that website there. I'm not going to say all of that name, but you can go to that. There's a lot there on just history in general, but you can go with that particular link. It should take you to an area that's dedicated to like things that happen within Judaism, medieval times, Christianity, Rome, etc. Another kind of very mostly academic resource is the, excuse me, excuse me, is the kesherjournal.com. All right. That has a lot of academic papers as well that you can look up, and then also some more like op-ed type stuff. And then as it involves Bible study, again, we didn't talk a lot about too much Bible stuff, but Torah resource with Tim Hegg, Torah class with Tom Bradford, and David Wilbert. Great places to go to. Tim Hegg's stuff, Torah resources, gotten much more of an academic, I would say, feel to it on average. Torah class, Tom Bradford does a Bible study class where he's gone through Genesis, through pretty much the bulk of the Tanakh. He's done Matthew, he's got a commentary on Acts, Romans, Revelations, and right now he's currently working through the prophets. David Wilbur, if you don't know who he is, look him up on YouTube. If you're into social media or things like that, there's other places you can go to, but YouTube, you can find his videos, he's got books. He is very much an up-and-coming scholar, if you will, of the Messianic movement. There are more than just him, but he's a really good one. If I remember right, no. I want to say no. I'm almost positive. I think I asked him that one time, and I remember the answers now. But he's a great resource as well. He's working on his doctorate degree. I think he had just gotten his master's, and he puts a bunch of stuff out there in reference to the Messianic way. Great ways of talking with people, argumentation, or as a resource to give to somebody. I'd be like, hey, maybe I can't explain it well enough, but read his stuff. I think it'll help walk you through your questions. He's got a lot of good stuff on that. In any case, that is it for this series. I would like to do kind of like we did last week. I think it gives a better flow. If anyone has questions or comments,